Get against the wall. The officer's voice thundered down the school hallway, drawing every eye as his hand hovered near his holster. The young boy, no older than 12, froze in place. His small hands gripped a tattered notebook against his chest, trembling. The hallway, moments ago filled with chatter and footsteps, fell silent. The boy looked confused, scared, unsure of what he had done wrong. I said, hands on the wall, the officer barked again, stepping closer, his presence intimidating, his tone dripping with disdain. But I didn't do anything, the boy stammered, his voice barely audible, each word catching in his throat. He glanced around, hoping for help from the gathering crowd of students and teachers. Instead, he met a sea of shocked faces, none daring to intervene. Don't talk back to me, kid. The officer reached out, grabbing the boy's arm roughly and spinning him toward the cold, unyielding lockers. The boy gasped as his cheek pressed against the metal. From the crowd, a man's voice cut through the tension, firm and alarmed. What are you doing to him? That's my son. The officer barely turned his head, his sneer unmistakable. Stay back, he snapped, waving the father off dismissively. I don't care who you are. This one's acting suspicious. The boy's father, dressed in plain clothes, stepped forward, his hands trembling not with fear but with barely contained rage. Suspicious? He's 12 years old. He's a student here. Let him go. His voice cracked with desperation, his eyes pleading as he locked onto his son's tearful gaze. I'm doing my job, the officer hissed, tightening his grip on the boy's arm. Kids like this? They think they can get away with anything. Not on my watch. The boy whimpered as the officer's hand pressed harder on his back, the sound breaking the father's composure. Kids like this? What is that supposed to mean? The father demanded, stepping closer, his voice rising. It means exactly what it sounds like, the officer shot back without hesitation, a twisted smirk forming on his face. I know trouble when I see it. Trouble? The father's voice was trembling now, no longer from rage alone but from a deeper wound, one that pierced his very soul. He knew what this was. Everyone in the hallway knew. The officer didn't see a boy, he saw a target, a stereotype, a scapegoat for his prejudice. Let him go, now, the father said, his voice low, steady, and commanding, but the officer didn't flinch. Instead, he pushed the boy harder against the lockers, as if making a point, asserting his power over the defenseless child. The boy cried out, his voice breaking as he choked on tears. Dad, please help me, he whispered, his words barely audible but piercing like a dagger into the man's chest. The father, his heart pounding, shouted again, let him go. The crowd murmured now, whispers of outrage and disbelief spreading like wildfire. Some students pulled out their phones, capturing the scene, their hands shaking as they recorded every second of the horrifying encounter. But the officer ignored it all. You think you're somebody, the officer spat at the father, his tone mocking. You think you can tell me how to do my job? I'm his father, the man shot back, his voice sharp and cutting. And I'm telling you to let my son go before you regret this. Regret it? The officer laughed, a cold, bitter sound. I don't take orders from you. Or from anyone else. I'm the law here. The father's lips tightened, his jaw clenched as he stared at the man who dared to treat his son like a criminal, like less than human. For a moment, he said nothing, his eyes blazing with restrained fury. He could feel every gaze in the hallway on him, every breath held, waiting to see what he would do. Finally, in a voice that cut through the air like a blade, he said, You have no idea who you're talking to. The officer hesitated, his smug grin faltering for the first time. But before he could respond, the sound of heavy boots echoed down the hallway. Uniformed officers, real ones, stormed into the building, their faces a mixture of shock and urgency as they saw the scene unfolding. What's going on here? One of them demanded, his eyes darting between the boy, his father, and the rogue officer. The father stepped back, his hands raised as he locked eyes with the newly arrived officers. "I'm the chief of police," he said, his voice calm but deadly serious. "And this man just assaulted my son." The hallway erupted into chaos. Gasps and murmurs filled the air as the weight of his words sank in. The officer's face turned ghostly pale, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He stumbled backward, releasing the boy as though his hands had been burned. You're, he stammered, the realization dawning too late. He had made a mistake, a colossal one, and it was clear that there would be no escaping the consequences. What happened next left the entire community in shock. The officer, once so smug and untouchable, would face a reckoning no one saw coming. The events that followed shattered the illusion of power he clung to, exposing not only his actions but a deeper rot within the system he thought protected him. But how does justice truly unfold when the tables are turned? What happens when the very authority someone abuses becomes their downfall? Stay with us as we unravel this powerful story of humiliation, vengeance, and ultimate justice. The ending will leave you speechless. At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against any form of racism or discrimination. To our Black viewers and all those who have faced injustice, we want you to know that you are seen, heard, and supported. This channel is a space for stories that challenge prejudice, inspire change, and amplify voices that matter. Now, sit back and enjoy an impactful story crafted just for you. Don't forget to subscribe to Plough of Twist and hit that like button to support more stories that stand for justice and equality. Thank you for being here. Let's dive in. The morning air was crisp as the first bell rang at Jefferson Middle School, signaling the start of another day. The hallways were a mix of chatter, laughter, and the clatter of lockers being opened and closed. Among the crowd of students, Marcus Washington walked with quiet confidence, his notebook tucked under his arm and a wide grin spread across his face. At just 12 years old, Marcus was already a standout in his community. He had a natural charisma that made people gravitate toward him, a boy who dreamed big, worked hard, and had the kind of energy that could light up a room. He was a straight-A student, loved by his teachers, and admired by his classmates. But beyond the accolades and achievements, Marcus was, at his core, just a kid. A kid who loved comic books, basketball, and making his dad proud. Marcus's father, David Washington, was everything Marcus aspired to be. Strong, disciplined, and unwaveringly fair, David had worked his way up to become the chief of police in their city, a position he held with both pride and a deep sense of responsibility. For David, the badge wasn't just a symbol of authority, it was a promise to his community that he would protect and serve, regardless of race, class, or background. He carried the weight of that promise with him every day, knowing that as one of the few Black police chiefs in the country, he had to work twice as hard to prove himself. But David wasn't just a leader in the precinct, he was a dedicated father, one who never missed a parent-teacher conference, a basketball game, or the opportunity to remind Marcus that he was capable of greatness. Their bond was unshakable, forged through years of shared moments and mutual respect. They lived in a modest but comfortable house in a neighborhood that had its challenges but was filled with people who looked out for one another. David had worked tirelessly to provide a stable life for Marcus after his wife's passing 5 years earlier. It hadn't been easy, but their little family of 2 had found their rhythm. Weekends were spent shooting hoops at the park, watching old movies, and talking about everything from school to life's bigger questions. For Marcus, his father was his hero. For David, his son was his greatest pride. On this particular morning, Marcus was excited. His science teacher had announced a competition, and Marcus had been brainstorming ideas for a project that could win first place. He couldn't wait to tell his dad about it over dinner. As he made his way to his locker, he greeted his friends with fist bumps and quick jokes, his laughter echoing down the hallway. Everything felt normal, routine. But in the background, unseen and unnoticed, the threads of an entirely different narrative were beginning to weave together. Officer Greg Harper was leaning against his patrol car outside the school, sipping his coffee and watching the students filter in. Harper had been assigned to the school as part of a community outreach program, a role he resented from the start. To him, it was a demotion, a punishment disguised as an assignment. Harper had a reputation on the force, one that was whispered about but rarely confronted. He was strict, confrontational, and had a history of making questionable calls. Beneath the polished uniform and badge was a man with a deep-seated bitterness, a belief that respect was something to be demanded, not earned. Harper's gaze followed the students, his eyes narrowing as they landed on Marcus. Something about the boy's easy confidence, his broad smile, and the way he carried himself struck a nerve. To Harper, Marcus was everything he despised, a kid who didn't seem to know his place, who walked through life as if the rules didn't apply to him. It was irrational, baseless, but the resentment festered nonetheless. Inside the school, Marcus was pulling books from his locker when he noticed Harper stepping into the building. The officer's presence wasn't unusual, he often patrolled the hallways during the morning rush, but today, there was something different in the way he moved. Harper's expression was tight, his strides purposeful, as if he were looking for something, or someone. When their paths crossed, Harper stopped. He stood in front of Marcus, his towering frame casting a shadow over the boy. Marcus looked up, startled but polite. "Good morning, Officer Harper," he said, his voice steady. Harper didn't respond. Instead, he eyed Marcus's notebook, the one he carried everywhere, filled with sketches and ideas for his science project. "What's in the notebook?" Harper asked, his tone sharp. Marcus blinked, confused by the question. "It's just my schoolwork," he replied. "Why?" Harper stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing tone. "Don't play smart with me, kid. I've seen your type before. You think you can get away with anything because people like me don't pay attention. Well, guess what? I do." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. He glanced around, hoping someone would intervene, but the hallway had gone quiet. Students and teachers alike were frozen, unsure of how to react. "I'm not doing anything wrong," Marcus said, his voice trembling now. "I'm just going to class." But Harper wasn't listening. He reached out and grabbed Marcus's arm, pulling him toward the lockers. "Hands on the wall," he barked. "Let's see if you're hiding anything." By now, a small crowd had gathered, their whispers filling the air like static. Marcus's heart raced as he felt the cold metal of the lockers against his cheek. He couldn't understand what was happening. He hadn't done anything, yet here he was, being treated like a criminal in front of his peers. The commotion drew David's attention as he entered the school for a routine meeting with the principal. When he saw his son pinned against the lockers, his blood ran cold. He pushed through the crowd, his voice cutting through the chaos. "What the hell is going on here?" Harper turned, his grip on Marcus unyielding. "Step back, sir," he said dismissively, not even glancing at David. David's voice rose, firm and unyielding. "That's my son. Let him go." But Harper didn't let go. Instead, he tightened his grip, a twisted smirk playing on his lips. "Your son. Figures. He's got trouble written all over him." David's hands curled into fists at his sides, his jaw tightening as he took a step forward. "I'm warning you," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Release him. Now." The tension in the hallway was suffocating. Every eye was on David and Harper, the air thick with unspoken words and unacknowledged truths. Harper hesitated, his bravado faltering for the first time. But the damage was done. What happened next would change everything, unraveling a chain of events that no one could have predicted and leaving a mark on everyone involved. The road to justice was just beginning, and it would be paved with revelations that would shake the entire community to its core. The principal's office was silent, the kind of silence that wasn't natural but forced, weighed down by the tension in the room. David sat across from the principal, his jaw tight, his hands resting on his knees, clenched into fists. Marcus sat next to him, his face pale, eyes fixed on the floor. The boy hadn't said much since the incident in the hallway, but his silence spoke louder than any words. It wasn't just fear, it was something deeper, a kind of shock that no 12-year-old should ever have to endure. The principal, a middle-aged man with a receding hairline and a constant look of discomfort, adjusted his tie and cleared his throat. "Chief Washington," he began cautiously, his words slow and deliberate, "I want to assure you that the school does not condone what happened today." David's eyes, sharp and unyielding, locked onto the principal. "Condone? That's all you have to say?" His voice was low but carried the weight of his fury. "My son was humiliated, assaulted, in front of his peers, and you think telling me the school doesn't condone it is enough?" The principal shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his gaze darting toward Marcus before returning to David. "I understand your anger, Chief. Truly, I do. Officer Harper was out of line, and there will be an investigation." But what?" David snapped, his voice rising just enough to make the principal flinch. "What excuse are you about to give me? That he was doing his job? That this was some kind of misunderstanding?" The principal hesitated, then sighed heavily. "I'm not making excuses. I'm trying to navigate this situation carefully. Officer Harper has been with the school for a year. He's respected by some of the staff." David cut him off, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Respected? By who? The same people who watched him assault my son and did nothing?" Marcus shifted in his seat, his small hands gripping the edge of the chair tightly. He still hadn't looked up, but his shoulders trembled slightly. David noticed and placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his voice softening just for a moment. "It's okay, son. We'll get through this." The principal cleared his throat again, clearly eager to regain control of the conversation. "Chief Washington, I want to assure you that disciplinary action will be taken. We've already placed Officer Harper on temporary leave pending an investigation." "Temporary leave," David repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "That's not enough. Not by a long shot." The door to the office opened, and a woman in a tailored suit stepped in, her heels clicking against the floor. It was Sarah James, the school district's legal counsel. Her presence added another layer of tension to the already fraught atmosphere. She carried a folder in one hand and an air of practiced calm, but even she couldn't hide the unease in her eyes. "Chief Washington," she began, her tone measured, "I understand this is a difficult situation, and I want to assure you that we are taking it very seriously." David didn't even look at her. His focus remained on Marcus, who still hadn't spoken. "You all keep saying the same thing," David said, his voice steady but filled with an edge of restrained anger. "Taking it seriously. Condemning the actions. None of it means anything if there are no real consequences." Sarah set the folder on the desk and folded her hands in front of her. "We're conducting a full review of Officer Harper's actions. Depending on the outcome, there could be termination, or what?" David interrupted, his gaze finally snapping to her. "A slap on the wrist? A transfer to another school? That man shouldn't be wearing a badge, let alone be around children." Sarah hesitated, then chose her words carefully. "Chief, I understand your frustration, but there are procedures we have to follow." "Due process." David stood abruptly, his presence towering over the room. "Don't talk to me about due process. I've been in law enforcement for over 20 years. I know the system, and I know how it protects people like Harper. My son deserves better. All these kids deserve better." Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but David wasn't finished. He turned to the principal, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Do you know what it felt like, watching my son, my 12-year-old son, be treated like a criminal? Watching that man put his hands on him while you stood by and did nothing?" The principal looked down, his face reddening. I didn't know what to do, he admitted quietly. That's the problem, David said, his voice heavy with disappointment. None of you knew what to do, so you did nothing. The silence that followed was suffocating. Marcus finally looked up, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Dad, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Can we go home? David's heart broke at the sound, but he nodded, placing a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. Yeah, son. Let's go. As they walked out of the office, the weight of the moment hung heavily in the air. David knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The system he had spent his career defending had failed his son, and he wasn't going to let it slide. Not this time. In the car, Marcus finally spoke again, his voice trembling. Why did he do it, Dad? Why did he hate me so much? David took a deep breath, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. It wasn't about you, son. It was about him. His ignorance, his fear. But we're going to make sure he answers for it. Marcus nodded, but the hurt in his eyes didn't fade. David knew this would stay with his son for a long time. The scars of that day wouldn't heal easily. But he also knew Marcus was strong, stronger than he realized. As they drove home, David's mind raced. He thought about the years he had spent fighting for justice, the countless hours he had poured into building trust within the community, only for it to be shattered in a single moment. He thought about Harper, about the arrogance in his eyes and the smirk on his face as he pinned Marcus against those lockers. And he thought about what needed to happen next. This wasn't just about his son. It was about every child who had ever been made to feel less than, about every parent who had watched their child suffer and felt powerless to stop it. David didn't just want accountability, he wanted change. And he knew that change wouldn't come easily. It would take everything he had, and then some. As they pulled into the driveway, Marcus looked at his father, his voice quiet but resolute. You won't let him get away with it, will you? David met his son's gaze, his own eyes filled with determination. Not a chance, he said firmly. Inside, the house was quiet, but the silence felt different now. It wasn't the comforting stillness of home, it was the calm before a storm. David sat at the kitchen table long after Marcus had gone to bed, his mind racing with plans and possibilities. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was ready. Because this wasn't just about one boy or one family. It was about justice, about standing up to a system that had allowed men like Harper to thrive for far too long. And as David sat there, the weight of the day pressing down on him, he made a promise, to his son, to his community, and to himself. What happened in that hallway wouldn't be forgotten. And it wouldn't go unanswered. The conference room at police headquarters was packed. Officers sat around the long table, their uniforms neatly pressed, but their faces showed varying degrees of tension. The usual camaraderie of these meetings had been replaced by an air of unease. At the head of the table sat David Washington, his presence commanding yet calm, a stark contrast to the storm brewing beneath his composed exterior. He scanned the room slowly, his eyes pausing briefly on each face, his silence speaking volumes. Across from him, Greg Harper sat stiffly, his arms crossed and his jaw tight. He hadn't said a word since he walked in, but his body language screamed defiance. The humiliation of being called into this meeting, in front of his peers, was written all over his face. Harper believed this was just another formality, a slap on the wrist orchestrated by an angry father trying to save face. He didn't understand what was coming. David's voice finally broke the silence, deep and steady but carrying an undeniable edge. Before we begin, I want to make something clear. This isn't just about what happened to my son. This is about accountability. This is about what kind of department we want to be. The murmurs that followed were uneasy. Some officers exchanged glances, others avoided eye contact altogether. Harper shifted in his chair but remained silent. David leaned forward slightly, placing his hands flat on the table. Officer Harper, he said, his tone measured but firm, do you have anything to say about the incident at Jefferson Middle School? Harper uncrossed his arms and leaned back in his chair, his expression a mix of annoyance and indignation. I was doing my job, he said flatly. That's what this is about, isn't it? Me doing my job and someone not liking it. David's gaze didn't waver. Doing your job, he repeated, his voice almost a whisper. Tell me, what part of your job involves pinning a 12-year-old boy against a locker and accusing him of crimes he didn't commit? Harper shrugged, his nonchalance infuriating. The kid was acting suspicious. I followed protocol. David's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. Suspicious, he said slowly, letting the word hang in the air. What exactly did he do that made you suspicious? Harper hesitated, his bravado faltering for the first time. He was lingering around. Watching people. He had that notebook, and I didn't know what was in it. Could have been anything. Could have been anything, David repeated, his tone sharpening. He leaned back, his eyes narrowing as he studied Harper. You mean to tell me you decided to detain a child because he was standing in a hallway with a notebook? Harper opened his mouth to respond but was interrupted by the door opening. Sarah James, the department's internal affairs investigator, walked in, a thick folder in her hands. She nodded briefly at David before taking a seat. Sorry I'm late, she said, her voice crisp. I've been going over the statements from witnesses at the school. Chief Washington, I think you'll find this relevant. David gestured for her to continue, his eyes never leaving Harper. Sarah opened the folder and began reading. Multiple students and staff members confirmed that Marcus Washington was doing nothing unusual before Officer Harper approached him. The school's security cameras show the same, he was walking to his locker, interacting with friends, and minding his own business. The room was silent, the weight of her words settling over the group like a heavy fog. Harper shifted uncomfortably but didn't speak. Sarah continued, her tone growing colder. Furthermore, the footage shows Officer Harper following Marcus for several minutes before confronting him. At no point does Marcus exhibit any behavior that could be considered suspicious. David's voice cut through the silence, calm but laced with steel. Care to explain that, Officer Harper? Harper's face flushed, his earlier bravado crumbling. I was just being cautious, he stammered. You never know what kids like him might be up to. The room froze at his words. The unspoken prejudice in Harper's statement hung in the air, undeniable and damning. David's expression didn't change, but the fire in his eyes burned brighter. Kids like him, David said softly, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying the force of a sledgehammer. You mean black kids? Harper didn't respond, but his silence was answer enough. Sarah closed the folder with a decisive snap. Officer Harper, she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade, your actions violated department policy, school policy, and basic human decency. This isn't just about misconduct, it's about abuse of power. Harper's face turned red, his hands clenching into fists. This is a setup, he muttered, his voice rising. You're all out to get me because I'm not afraid to do my job. David stood, his chair scraping against the floor. He didn't shout, but his presence filled the room, silencing Harper instantly. Your job, he said, his voice low and steady, is to protect and serve. Not to harass and intimidate. Not to humiliate a child in front of his peers. You didn't just fail at your job, you disgraced it. The room was deathly quiet. Even those who might have sympathized with Harper before seemed to shrink under David's gaze. David turned to Sarah. What are the next steps? Sarah's tone was professional but firm. Officer Harper will be placed on administrative leave effective immediately, pending a formal review. Given the evidence, I expect that review to result in termination. Harper shot to his feet, his chair toppling over. You can't do this, he shouted, his voice desperate now. You're only doing this because he's your kid. If it were anyone else, this wouldn't even be a conversation. David took a step closer, his voice calm but deadly serious. If it were anyone else's child, I'd still be standing here. Because no child deserves what you did to my son. Harper opened his mouth to argue, but the door opened again, and two uniformed officers entered. "Officer Harper," one of them said, "you need to come with us." Harper looked around the room, his eyes wild, searching for someone, anyone, to defend him. But no one moved. No one spoke. His protests faded as the officers escorted him out, leaving the room in heavy silence. David remained standing, his gaze fixed on the door long after Harper had disappeared. Finally, he turned back to the room, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This isn't just about one officer. It's about all of us. We have to be better. For our community. For our children. For ourselves." As he sat down, the tension in the room began to ease, but the weight of what had happened remained. The reckoning wasn't over, it was only beginning. The sound of the conference room door closing behind Harper reverberated in the silence, but no one moved. David sat at the head of the table, his face unreadable. His mind was racing, a tangle of emotions threatening to break through the calm facade he had worked so hard to maintain. There was no satisfaction in seeing Harper led away. This wasn't about personal vindication, this was about the principle, the justice his son deserved, and the reckoning that was long overdue. The officers around the table shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked at David with a newfound respect, others with unease, and a few avoided his gaze entirely. It was Sarah James who broke the silence, her voice steady and professional, but with an undercurrent of urgency. "Chief Washington, with Harper's removal, will need to prepare a public statement. This case has already drawn significant attention, and I expect that to intensify." David nodded slowly, his fingers interlaced on the table. "We'll address it," he said, his voice measured. "But this isn't just about a statement. It's about action. The people in this city need to see that we're serious about accountability, that we're willing to root out the problems within our own department." A younger officer, one who had been quiet until now, cleared his throat nervously. "Chief, if I may. I think what you did was the right thing, but not everyone's going to see it that way. There are officers who feel like Harper was just doing his job. They think this is setting a dangerous precedent." David's eyes narrowed slightly, and he leaned forward, his tone calm but firm. "A dangerous precedent? You think holding someone accountable for abusing their power is dangerous?" The young officer hesitated, then shook his head. "No, sir. I mean, I don't think that. I've heard the whispers, and I thought you should know." David sighed, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on his shoulders. "Whispers are how these problems fester," he said. "If anyone in this department thinks what Harper did was acceptable, they're part of the problem. And I will deal with them, too." Sarah chimed in, her tone brisk but supportive. "Chief, you're right. This department needs to know that there's a zero-tolerance policy for behavior like Harper's. But the way we communicate that will matter. If we frame this as an opportunity to rebuild trust, we can get ahead of the backlash." David nodded again, appreciating her pragmatism even as his emotions churned beneath the surface. "You're right," he said. "This isn't just about punishment, it's about change." The meeting ended shortly after, the officers filing out one by one, leaving David and Sarah alone in the room. Sarah closed her folder and looked at him, her expression softening slightly. "You handled that well, Chief," she said. "But I know this is personal for you. Are you okay?" David let out a long breath, leaning back in his chair. "No, Sarah. I'm not okay. My son was humiliated, traumatized, by someone who was supposed to protect him. And I have to sit here and act like this is just another day at the office. It's not." Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "You're doing the right thing," she said gently. But don't forget to take care of yourself, too. Marcus needs you. David's throat tightened at the mention of his son. He's strong, he said, his voice quieter now. But this has changed him. I see it in his eyes. He's questioning things he shouldn't have to question at his age. Sarah stood, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. And because of you, he'll see that justice is possible. That fighting back is worth it. David didn't respond, but her words stayed with him as he left the room and headed home. The drive was quiet, the city lights blurring together as his mind replayed the events of the past week. By the time he pulled into the driveway, the weight of everything felt almost unbearable. Inside, Marcus was sitting at the kitchen table, his notebook open in front of him. He looked up as David entered, his expression guarded. "Hey, Dad," he said softly. David set his bag down and walked over, ruffling Marcus's hair gently. "Hey, buddy. How was school?" Marcus shrugged, looking back down at his notebook. "It was okay, I guess. People keep asking me about what happened." David pulled out a chair and sat across from him, his heart aching at the sight of his son's downcast face. "What do you tell them?" he asked carefully. Marcus hesitated, then looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and sadness. "I don't know what to say. I don't want to talk about it, but they keep bringing it up. Some kids think it's cool that my dad's the chief of police and that you stood up to that officer. But some of them act like I did something wrong." David's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Listen to me, Marcus. You didn't do anything wrong. What happened wasn't your fault. It was Harper's fault. And I'm making sure he's held accountable." Marcus nodded slowly, but the uncertainty in his eyes didn't fade. "What if nothing changes, Dad? What if people like him keep doing stuff like that?" David reached across the table, placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Things will change, son. It takes time, and it's not always easy, but it's worth it. And you've already helped make that happen. By standing strong, by being who you are, you're making a difference." Marcus's lips quirked into a small, hesitant smile. "You really think so?" David smiled back, his voice filled with conviction. "I know so." The moment was interrupted by the sound of David's phone buzzing on the counter. He stood, checking the screen, and his expression darkened. "I need to take this," he said, stepping into the other room. The voice on the other end belonged to Sarah, and it was urgent. "Chief, we've got a problem," she said. "Harper's been talking. He's trying to stir up trouble, claiming this whole thing is a setup." David closed his eyes, his grip tightening on the phone. "Let him talk," he said. "The evidence speaks for itself." "I thought you'd say that," Sarah replied. "But you should know, there are people listening. Some of them are siding with him." David felt a surge of frustration but forced himself to stay composed. "Let them," he said. "We're not backing down." As he ended the call, David returned to the kitchen, his resolve stronger than ever. He knew the fight wasn't over, but he also knew he wasn't fighting alone. Marcus looked up at him, a question in his eyes, but David simply smiled and sat back down. "Everything okay?" Marcus asked hesitantly. David nodded, his voice steady. "Yeah, buddy. Everything's going to be okay." But deep down, he knew the hardest part was still to come. The days that followed Harper's removal were a whirlwind of tension and uncertainty. News of the incident at Jefferson Middle School had spread beyond the city, catching the attention of local media and sparking debates on social media. Every headline, every comment section, seemed to echo the same question: was this an isolated act of prejudice, or a symptom of something much larger? For David Washington, the answer was clear, but convincing others wasn't going to be easy. At home, Marcus was struggling to adjust. His usual enthusiasm had been replaced by a guarded quietness that broke David's heart. Marcus had always been resilient, but this experience had shaken something in him. It wasn't just the humiliation or the fear, it was the realization that the world wasn't as just as he'd been taught to believe. David noticed the way Marcus flinched at sudden noises, how he avoided eye contact when people asked him questions. His son was carrying a weight that no child should have to bear, and it filled David with a deep, simmering anger. Meanwhile, at the precinct, the fallout from Harper's actions was becoming harder to contain. Officers who had once been loyal to David were now divided. Some openly supported his decision to remove Harper, applauding his commitment to justice and accountability. Others, however, whispered behind his back, questioning his leadership and accusing him of letting personal emotions cloud his judgment. David was no stranger to scrutiny, but this was different. The dissent was more vocal, more personal, and it was starting to infect the department's morale. One afternoon, as David walked through the precinct, he overheard a group of officers talking in hushed tones near the break room. Their words stopped him in his tracks. "He's making us look weak," one officer said, his voice dripping with disdain. Harper might have been rough, but he didn't deserve to be hung out to dry like that. Another officer chimed in, quieter but no less bitter. "The chief's only doing this because it was his kid. If it were anyone else, he wouldn't have gone this far." David took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He stepped into the room, and the conversation died instantly. The officers froze, their faces betraying a mix of guilt and defiance. "Is there something you'd like to say to me directly?" David asked, his voice calm but firm. The first officer hesitated, then shook his head. "No, Chief. We were just talking." David nodded slowly, his eyes locking onto each of them in turn. "Good. Because if I ever hear anyone in this department defending what Harper did, you'll be out of here faster than you can finish your coffee. Do I make myself clear?" The officers nodded reluctantly, their gazes dropping to the floor. Satisfied, David turned and walked away, but the encounter stayed with him. He knew he couldn't ignore the growing divide within his team, but he also knew that he couldn't afford to waver. The stakes were too high, not just for him, but for the community he had sworn to protect. Later that evening, David sat at his kitchen table, poring over case files and statements related to Harper. The evidence was damning, but David knew that wouldn't be enough to sway public opinion. The city was on edge, with protests beginning to form on both sides of the issue. On one side were those who supported David's actions, demanding systemic changes within the police force. On the other were Harper's defenders, who framed the incident as an overreaction and accused David of betraying his own department. The knock at the door startled him. He wasn't expecting anyone, and it was too late for casual visits. When he opened the door, he was surprised to see Sarah James standing there, her expression tense. "Sarah," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "What brings you here this late?" She handed him a folder, her jaw tight. "I thought you should see this. It's about Harper." David opened the folder, his eyes scanning the documents inside. His stomach turned as he read. The file contained a detailed history of complaints against Harper, many of which had been dismissed or buried. Excessive force, racial profiling, even allegations of falsifying reports, it was all there, and it painted a picture far worse than David had anticipated. This is a pattern," David said, his voice heavy with disbelief. "How did he stay on the force this long?" Sarah crossed her arms, her expression grim. "Because no one wanted to deal with it. Every time a complaint was filed, it got swept under the rug. Either the victims didn't want to pursue it, or someone higher up decided it wasn't worth the trouble." David's jaw clenched as he closed the folder. "Not anymore. This ends now." Sarah hesitated, then spoke carefully. "David, you need to be prepared. If this goes public, it's not just Harper who'll be under scrutiny. The entire department will be. Including you." David met her gaze, his expression unwavering. "If that's what it takes to fix this, so be it. The next morning, David called an emergency meeting with the department's leadership team. The tension in the room was palpable as he addressed them, laying out the contents of Harper's file and outlining his plan to implement stricter accountability measures. The reactions were mixed, some nodded in agreement, while others bristled at the implications. One senior officer, a man named Daniels, voiced the concerns many were too afraid to say. "Chief, I respect what you're trying to do, but this is going to tear the department apart. If you push this, you'll lose the support of your officers. Is that a risk you're willing to take?" David's response was immediate. "Yes, it is. Because if we can't hold ourselves accountable, we have no business wearing this badge. This department needs to change, and that starts now." The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Daniels looked at him for a long moment, then nodded reluctantly. "All right, Chief. But you'd better be ready for the fallout." David was ready. He had no choice but to be. As he left the meeting, he felt a mix of resolve and exhaustion. The path ahead was daunting, but he knew it was the right one. At home, Marcus was waiting for him, his expression anxious. "How did it go?" he asked. David smiled faintly, ruffling his son's hair. "It's going to be tough," he admitted. "But we're making progress." Marcus hesitated, then hugged his father tightly. "I'm proud of you, Dad." Those words meant everything to David. They reminded him why he was fighting, why he couldn't give up. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope. The city seemed to hold its breath in the days following David's announcement of sweeping reforms within the department. The streets were alive with tension, a mix of hope and defiance depending on who you spoke to. Local news outlets buzzed with coverage of the story, painting David as either a hero of justice or a man tearing his own department apart. Protesters lined the steps of City Hall, their chants and signs bearing starkly different messages. Some praised his courage, calling for more leaders like him. Others decried his actions as a betrayal, demanding his resignation. At home, David found little reprieve. The quiet moments with Marcus, once a source of comfort, were now tinged with unease. Marcus was trying to put on a brave face, but David could see the cracks. His son's questions were more pointed now, his curiosity laced with a mix of fear and anger. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table, Marcus put down his fork and looked at his father with eyes far too serious for a 12-year-old. "Dad," he began, his voice steady but uncertain, "do you think the other officers hate you now?" The question hit David like a blow. He paused, setting his glass down carefully before answering. "Why do you ask that, Marcus?" Marcus shrugged, but his gaze didn't waver. "I hear things. At school, on the news. Some people are saying you're making enemies, that you're putting yourself in danger. Are they right?" David leaned forward, his hands resting on the table. "Marcus, listen to me. Doing the right thing isn't always popular. Sometimes it makes people uncomfortable, especially when it means challenging what they've gotten used to. But that doesn't mean we stop. We have to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard." Marcus frowned, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his plate. "But what if they come after you? What if they try to hurt you because of what you're doing?" David's chest tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "Then I'll deal with it. I'm not afraid, Marcus, because I know I'm doing the right thing. And I want you to remember that too. Courage isn't about not being scared, it's about doing what's right, even when you are." Marcus nodded slowly, but the worry in his eyes didn't fade. David reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand on his son's. "We're going to be okay, Marcus. I promise." That night, after Marcus had gone to bed, David sat in the living room, staring at the television without really watching it. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, and he picked it up to see Sarah's name on the screen. He answered with a tired, "What's going on?" Sarah's voice was tense. "David, we've got another problem." There's a group of officers meeting off the clock, and they're not being subtle about their feelings toward you. I've heard rumors about them trying to push you out. David rubbed his temples, closing his eyes. Let me guess, Harper's at the center of it. Of course he is, Sarah replied. He's been talking to anyone who will listen, trying to paint himself as the victim. And some people are buying it. David let out a long breath, his frustration mounting. I knew this wouldn't be easy, but it's worse than I thought. How many are siding with him? Not a majority, Sarah said quickly. But enough to cause trouble. David, you need to be careful. This isn't just about your job anymore. It's about your safety. David's grip on the phone tightened. I'm not backing down, Sarah. They can threaten me all they want, but I'm not stopping until we fix this. I figured you'd say that, Sarah said with a sigh. Just promise me you'll watch your back. You've got people who support you, but you've also got enemies now. Don't underestimate them. David promised, but as he ended the call, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease. He had always known there would be resistance, but the idea that his own officers might turn against him was a bitter pill to swallow. He sat in the dark for a long time, thinking about the battles ahead and the toll they were taking. The next day, as he arrived at the precinct, the atmosphere was colder than usual. Conversations hushed as he walked past, and a few officers avoided his gaze entirely. David kept his head high, refusing to let the tension break him. He had a meeting with the mayor later that afternoon, and he knew it would be a crucial moment in determining the future of his reforms. When he entered the mayor's office, he was greeted with a firm handshake and a guarded expression. Mayor Caldwell was a seasoned politician, known for his pragmatism and his ability to read a room. He motioned for David to sit, and the two men faced each other across a polished desk. Chief Washington, the mayor began, his tone neutral, I've been following the situation closely. You've certainly stirred things up. David met his gaze evenly. Change always does, Mayor. But it's necessary. The mayor nodded slowly, leaning back in his chair. I don't disagree. Harper's actions were unacceptable, and your decision to hold him accountable was the right one. But you've also created a lot of unrest, both within the department and in the community. I need to know if you have a plan to address that. David leaned forward, his voice steady. I do. The first step is transparency. The community needs to see that we're taking this seriously, that we're willing to confront the issues within our own ranks. The second step is accountability, not just for Harper, but for anyone who thinks they can abuse their power without consequences. And the third step is rebuilding trust, both within the department and with the public. The mayor listened carefully, his expression unreadable. When David finished, Caldwell nodded again, though his tone remained cautious. It's a good plan, David. But it's also ambitious. You're asking people to change the way they think, the way they operate. That doesn't happen overnight. I know, David said. But it has to start somewhere. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes to see it through. The mayor studied him for a long moment, then extended his hand. All right, Chief. You have my support. But know this, if things spiral out of control, I'll have to step in. I hope it doesn't come to that. David shook his hand firmly. It won't. Thank you, Mayor. As he left the office, David felt a renewed sense of determination. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he knew he wasn't walking it alone. He thought of Marcus, of the promise he had made to his son, and he resolved to keep fighting, no matter what it cost. As David walked back into the precinct that evening, the weight of the mayor's words lingered in his mind. The support was a relief, but it came with a clear warning: any misstep, any loss of control, and the ground beneath him would crumble. He knew the stakes had never been higher. Every move he made was under scrutiny, every decision dissected not just by his department but by the city as a whole. Inside, the tension was palpable. A few officers nodded at him as he passed, their gestures brief but respectful. Others kept their heads down, their silence louder than words. David could feel the fractures within the team widening. He paused in front of the bulletin board, scanning the notices and announcements pinned there, as if they could provide some semblance of normalcy. But the whispers behind him broke through the momentary distraction. "He's making this department a joke," a voice muttered, low but loud enough for David to hear. "How are we supposed to trust someone who's more concerned with politics than his own officers?" David turned slowly, his gaze sharp as it landed on Officer Daniels, the same man who had voiced his concerns during the leadership meeting. Daniels didn't flinch but met David's stare with a challenging expression. "Is there something you'd like to share with the class, Officer Daniels?" David asked, his tone calm but carrying an undeniable edge. Daniels straightened, his posture rigid. "With all due respect, Chief, I'm just saying what a lot of us are thinking. This whole Harper thing, it's gone too far. You're dragging all of us into the mud for one bad call. Morale's at an all-time low, and it's because of you." David stepped closer, his voice dropping so only Daniels and a few nearby officers could hear. "Morale is low because people like you think accountability is optional. Because some of you are more worried about protecting your egos than protecting the people we serve. If that's your idea of what this department stands for, then you're right, maybe this isn't the place for you." Daniels's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. The other officers nearby exchanged uneasy glances, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. David didn't wait for a reply. He turned and walked away, his shoulders squared, but the encounter left a bitter taste in his mouth. The resistance within his own ranks was growing stronger, and he knew it wouldn't be long before it reached a breaking point. That night, David sat at his desk, reviewing the latest reports and updates on the internal investigation into Harper. The deeper they dug, the worse it got. More complaints had surfaced, some dating back years. The picture that emerged was one of a man who had been allowed to operate unchecked for far too long. But what disturbed David the most was the realization that others in the department had likely known and done nothing. The knock at his office door pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up to see Sarah standing there, a folder in her hand and a weary expression on her face. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, setting the folder on his desk. "More complaints," she said simply, her voice heavy with frustration. "It's like peeling back layers of rot. The more we uncover, the worse it smells." David flipped through the file, his expression grim. "How did this go on for so long?" he muttered, more to himself than to Sarah. "Because no one wanted to deal with it," Sarah replied, sinking into the chair across from him. "It's easier to look the other way, to pretend it's someone else's problem. Until it's not." David closed the folder and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "This isn't just about Harper anymore. This is about the culture of this department. If we don't change it, this will keep happening." Sarah nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "The question is, how do you change something so ingrained? It's not just policies and procedures, it's attitudes, biases, the way people think." David leaned forward, his elbows on the desk. "You change it by starting at the top. By showing that no one is above accountability. And by proving that doing the right thing doesn't mean sacrificing the people who depend on us." Sarah studied him for a moment, then smiled faintly. "You're not just fighting for your son, are you? You're fighting for all of them." David's throat tightened, but he nodded. "Marcus was the one who opened my eyes, but this isn't just about him. It's about every kid who's ever been treated like they don't matter. Every parent who's had to teach their child how to survive in a world that doesn't see their worth. If we can't fix this, then what's the point of any of it?" Sarah reached across the desk, placing a hand on his. "You're doing the right thing, David. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." David smiled faintly, appreciating her support more than he could say. But as she left, the weight of everything settled back onto his shoulders. The road ahead was long, and the obstacles were daunting, but he was determined to see it through. The next morning, David received an anonymous tip about a meeting being held by Harper and some of his supporters. It was happening off-site, away from department oversight, but the implications were clear. They were organizing, trying to rally enough support to undermine David's leadership. He debated whether to confront them directly or let the investigation play out, but ultimately, he decided he couldn't ignore it. That evening, he drove to the address provided in the tip, a small, dimly lit bar on the outskirts of town. As he stepped inside, the conversations hushed, and all eyes turned to him. Harper was seated at a table near the back, surrounded by a group of officers. His expression darkened as he saw David approach. "Chief," Harper said, his tone mocking. "What brings you to our little gathering?" David ignored the sarcasm and addressed the group as a whole. "I heard there was a meeting about the future of this department. Thought I'd join the conversation." Harper leaned back in his chair, smirking. "This isn't your kind of meeting, Chief. We're just a bunch of guys talking about how to save this department from someone who's tearing it apart." David stepped closer, his voice calm but firm. "You want to save this department? Then start by holding yourself accountable. Stop blaming everyone else for your failures and take responsibility for your actions." Harper's smirk faltered, and his expression hardened. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? But all you're doing is dividing us. You're making enemies, Chief. That's not leadership." David's gaze didn't waver. "Leadership isn't about being liked. It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard. And what you did, what you've been doing, is wrong. You can try to spin it however you want, but the truth doesn't change." The room was silent, the tension thick. Harper stood, his posture tense as he stared David down. "You think you're better than me," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you're untouchable." David didn't flinch. "I think I'm willing to fight for what's right. And if that makes me your enemy, so be it." The two men stared at each other, the air between them crackling with unspoken challenges. Finally, Harper scoffed and sat back down, waving David off dismissively. "You've made your point, Chief. Now get out." David didn't move for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the group. Then he turned and walked out, the door closing behind him with a heavy thud. As he drove home, he knew the battle was far from over, but he also knew he couldn't back down. Too much was at stake. For Marcus. For the department. For the future. The courtroom was packed. Every seat was filled, and even the walls were lined with people eager to witness the resolution of a case that had shaken the city to its core. The murmurs of conversation hushed as the judge entered, her expression stern, her presence commanding. David Washington sat near the front, his posture straight but his hands clenched tightly together. Beside him was Marcus, who had insisted on being there. The boy's face was calm, but David knew the courage it had taken for his son to sit in this room, to face the weight of what had happened. At the defense table sat Greg Harper. His once confident demeanor had eroded over the past weeks, his arrogance replaced with a simmering bitterness. His lawyer whispered something to him, but Harper barely acknowledged it. He sat rigidly, his eyes fixed on the judge, though his jaw tightened every time his gaze drifted toward David and Marcus. The trial had been grueling, filled with testimony after testimony that painted a clear picture of Harper's history of misconduct. Witnesses had come forward, some reluctantly, others with anger in their voices, recounting incidents that had been buried for years. Marcus had testified as well, his voice steady despite the tremble in his hands. He spoke about the fear, the humiliation, and the questions that still haunted him. When he finished, the courtroom had been silent, the weight of his words settling over everyone like a heavy fog. Today, it was time for the verdict. The judge looked out over the room, her expression unreadable, before finally speaking. After reviewing the evidence presented and considering the testimonies given, this court finds the defendant, Greg Harper, guilty of misconduct, abuse of power, and falsifying reports. Sentencing will follow, but let it be clear, justice must be served. A wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom, but David didn't react immediately. He glanced at Marcus, who was staring straight ahead, his expression a mixture of relief and something deeper, something that looked like healing. David placed a hand on his son's shoulder, squeezing gently, and Marcus finally turned to him, a small, tentative smile breaking through the tension. As the courtroom emptied, Harper was led away in handcuffs. He didn't look at David or Marcus as he passed, but the weight of his defeat was evident in every step. For years, he had acted without consequence, but now, the walls he had built around himself had crumbled. Justice, long overdue, had finally caught up with him. Outside, the air was crisp, the sun shining brightly as if to mark the end of a storm. Reporters swarmed the steps of the courthouse, their questions shouted into the crowd. David shielded Marcus as they made their way through, offering no comment. This moment wasn't about public statements or sound bites, it was about a father and son reclaiming a sense of peace. Later that evening, at home, the atmosphere was different. Lighter. Marcus sat at the kitchen table, sketching in his notebook while David cooked dinner. The sound of sizzling food filled the room, accompanied by the occasional clink of plates and the soft hum of Marcus humming to himself. It was a far cry from the silence that had dominated their home weeks earlier. "Dad," Marcus said suddenly, looking up from his drawing. "Do you think things will really change? Like, for other kids like me?" David turned, wiping his hands on a towel as he considered the question. "I think change takes time, Marcus. But what we did, what you did, it's a start. And sometimes, that's all you need to make a difference." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, his gaze returning to his notebook. For the first time in weeks, he seemed at ease, as though a weight he hadn't even fully understood had been lifted. The department wasn't the same either. David's reforms had faced resistance, but the trial had made it clear that the old ways could no longer be tolerated. Officers who supported Harper's behavior were either disciplined or chose to leave, and those who remained began to see the importance of the changes David had fought so hard to implement. It wasn't perfect, change never was, but it was progress. Months later, at a community event, David stood on a stage addressing a crowd of families, students, and city officials. Marcus stood beside him, holding a plaque that had been presented to David for his leadership. As David spoke about accountability, justice, and the future, he glanced down at his son, who looked up at him with pride. This wasn't just a moment for the city, it was a moment for them, a reminder of what they had overcome together. As the event ended and people began to disperse, Marcus tugged at David's sleeve. "Dad," he said, "you know how you always tell me to stand up for what's right, no matter what." David smiled, kneeling slightly to meet his son's gaze. "Yeah, I do." Marcus grinned, his eyes bright. "You're really good at it." David's heart swelled, and he pulled Marcus into a hug, the world around them fading away. In that moment, everything they had endured felt worth it. They had faced the storm and come out stronger, together. To those watching this story, what would you have done in David's place? Would you have fought as hard for what was right, knowing the cost? Justice is often messy and difficult, but it's worth it. And for Marcus, for every child like him, it's necessary. We'd love to hear your thoughts, share your perspective in the comments below. And if you found this story as powerful as we did, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more stories that challenge, inspire, and leave you thinking long after they're over. Thank you for being part of this journey.